Hey everybody, DM Jim here, and welcome to a new episode of the Tabletop Engineer. I was in my gaming store recently, and something caught my eye. It was these 50 millimeter bases. I'm going to put a picture up right now as I took a picture of them. They really caught my eye, and I just wasn't in the place to spend that kind of money on two bases. So I got home and it kept bothering me, and so I finally decided, you know what, I'm going to try and make it. So in this video, I'm going to show you the steps I took. It involves designing something in CAD, specifically Tinkercad, and I'm going to show you how I 3D printed it and painted it up and used some rocks and sand and the little, sticky, shrubs and stuff. And I'm going to show you how I made this. Let's get to the tabletop and I'll show you. I began this project in Tinkercad by dropping a cylinder on the workspace. I made it 50 millimeter diameter and then shrunk it down to 5 millimeters tall. If I was going to do this again, I might increase that to 7 or 8 millimeters, but 5 is fine. After creating the cylinder and then flattening it, which is going to be the base that I'm creating, I started using one of the tools in Tinkercad called Sketch. It basically just lets you sketch out a rough shape and then it turns it into a 3D object. So what I did was I just started making a bunch of irregular shaped tiles that will be placed on top of the base. Now most of these tiles are going to be rectangular or square shaped, and then of course you want to add chipped areas. In order to make it a solid object, you will have to fill in the drawing as I'm doing here. You just color it in, go all the way around. It's a little time consuming, not really, but you're going to be making 15 to 20 of these. So I'm going to show you here how I made maybe 2 or 3, and then I'll jump ahead. So I just use the draw tool to fill it in. It doesn't matter what color you're doing. I just happen to have blue here. It's really going to be, when you 3D print it, it's going to be whatever color filament you have. You click the done button and then it creates this tile like this. You want to shrink it down a little bit and then make another one. Now for all of these little tiles, I was trying to shoot for a height of about 5.5 millimeters. Eventually, I will make them irregular. Some will be 5 millimeters, some will be 5.5, some will go up to 6, and that'll make it so that the final product, the tiles, won't look so perfect. They'll vary in height, and that's really what you want. So when you're drawing a bunch of these, just realize that you can alter the height later. You can even there's an eraser tool also where you can erase sections if you aren't happy with what you made. Now right here I'm going to make one more for you. Now you'll want to make these in various shapes and stuff like that. This one I just broke it where it had a chipped edge, but otherwise it's mostly square. I was looking at the photo that I took of the actual base that I'm going off of, and I tried to emulate some of the shapes there, just not copy them exactly, but just to make it look sort of similar. All right, so I shrink it down, and here you can see I've drawn a bunch more. So I just continued making irregular shapes, and again, this is all based on what you want your base to look like. I intended to have some open areas where I will glue in some sand. And then of course I had some chipped tiles and things like that. This is all based on your preference. If you want, you could tile the whole thing and not leave any open areas for like sand. But again, I was going for duplicating the base that I showed you earlier in the photo, and that meant leaving some open areas. I'm going to shrink this down, and here you'll see I set it to 5.5 millimeters tall, and it's basically just dragging it into place and rotating things and just making it look like what you want. Now you're probably going, hey, it's no longer circular. Later in the video I'm going to show you how to carve out what you've done, leaving behind a circular base with a slight bevel. So I'm going to make one more here, maybe a couple. Oops. You can use the rotate tools on these to sort of spin them around, resize them, so that where they can be fit in where you want them to go. Here I am rotating a piece because I think it'll look good right there in the corner. So you'll just have to play around with it and make sure it looks good to you. I kept tinkering with it and shrinking and enlarging stones until it got to where I liked it. Now there was one little area down at the bottom, little rounded area there that I still was not pleased with. So I just made a copy of one of the existing stones and then put it over that, and that ended my creation of the rough base and tiles. So here I am making a copy of it, drag it down, rotate it around a little bit, and then plug it into place. And there you go. All right, again, it's very ugly looking, but just trust me, there is a way to cut it out. Now what I'm doing here is I'm just clicking on individual tiles and just shifting them with the arrow keys in little teeny tiny increments to make sure they're not touching. Once I was happy with that, I began resizing the tiles height-wise. I chose 0.1 millimeter increments, and then I went in here and I just dragged up certain stones. I would drag them higher. I would drag some stones lower. I just did this until I sort of felt like the stones were all, had a nice variety of heights, and just they weren't all flat and level. Alright, so the next thing I did was I selected all of them, and then I held the shift key down and clicked on the orange, which basically deselects the orange base that I started with. And then I raised all of the tiles up slightly. And this is where I'm going to add a texture to the top. So I went out to a custom shape. As you can see here, you got to go hunt for it. It's on number 17 of the custom objects. And it's just called terrain. It's green right there. I dragged it out. I resized it much larger than the base I'm working on. Just drag it big. And then I rotated it 180 degrees so that the rough side is facing down. And I raised that up off the table a little bit and made it a whole object. So it's basically negative space. Any solid object that a whole object intersects with, when you group those objects, sort of paste them together, it cuts out whatever is the negative space. Now, again, this is just a trial and error. I experimented with lowering it, raising it, until I was happy with the way it cut and made the tiles uneven. Now, one thing you got to be careful of is you don't want it to remove the lines or the gaps between the tiles. So what you're going to see here is me making some mistakes and correcting them. I would enlarge and move the terrain around and then group it again with the solid objects. And I would zoom in and look to see, you know, did it damage the tiles more than I wanted, or does it look good? Okay, so right here, you're going to see me make a copy of the terrain, and then I'm going to rotate it. I cut and paste, and then I rotate it a little bit, and then I move it around and try to cover some of the tiles that don't have any kind of contour or texture to them. And again, trial and error, trial and error. I probably spent the most time on this, which was maybe like 20 or 30 minutes, probably not even that long. I didn't want the tiles to be completely smooth. So here you go. You can start seeing, if you look carefully, you can see that the tiles are sort of damaged and they have unique contours to them. Ultimately, I ended up using 3 different copies of the terrain and putting them over the solid piece and then merging them, and then what you see here is the final result. Now it's time to actually cut out the shape. So what I did was I started with a cone and I enlarged it to 50 millimeter diameter. I stretched the cone a little tall, but the cone will have this beveled edge. I drew out a rectangle greater than 50 millimeters and then shrunk it down a little bit. I turned the cone into a hole object and grouped it with that rectangle, and it left a hole in the center, as you'll see in just a second, right there. Then I took this piece and I turned it into a hole object, negative space, and I dragged it over the solid object, and I just kind of moved it around until I felt like I could look in the circle and see all the tiles that I wanted. Once I was happy with that, you select both objects. You select the whole object and the solid object, and you draw a line around them, and then you use the group button to combine them. You'll see a little bit of blue on the bottom there that is left over that wasn't covered, and I'll fix that in a moment. But what's left over is this round base. You'll see it in just a second. There it is, with these little slivers of wasted space. I just took more boxes and turned them into whole objects and overlapped them with those little waste pieces. And then I grouped everything together, and it just eliminates those little bits of waste and leaves behind just the base that you want. So there is the final base, and you can play with the height if you like. You can shrink it, raise it up, whatever you want to do. Once you're happy with it, you need to export it as an STL file, which is what I'm going to do right here. You click on the export button, you choose the STL option, and it will download the file to your computer, and then you run that through a G-code converter software like Cura. Here I am printing that Cura created file. Only took about 50 some odd minutes to finish, and you'll see the final tile right there. Just pulled it off of the bed. Before I primed it, I took some white glue, squeezed it down in certain areas, wiped clean the tiles where it overflowed, and then I just dumped some sand over it. And if any sand was left where I didn't want it to be, I just used my finger to just brush it off. But this basically filled in sand in those areas where tiles were obviously missing. Again, you could go down in those very fine gaps if you wanted to, but I knew I was going to sort of paint those anyway, and I didn't think the sand would be visible down in there. And then I went out and I hit it with this darker gray primer, brought it in, and then touched up the sand with some sand-colored paint. And the reason I hit it with the paint and didn't leave it the natural color sand is the natural color sand just doesn't look right, in my opinion. You need the paint, which is more vivid. I went down in the grooves with a little bit of the brown paint here and there to simulate sand down in there. Then I used a standard gray and dry brushed all of the tiles. Then I switched over to a white paint, just a white miniature paint, and I dry brushed that over the gray, and I was very, very light with it. Once that dried, I mixed up a lighter gray and did a more sort of, not heavier, but just a dry brushing again. Then I went around the entire edge with a dark black. As you can see here, this is before anything else has been added to it. Now I'm adding little tufts. These are Army Painter products. And then I used some super glue and dropped some little rocks on it. And then I took some tan paint and hit even tinier little rocks. And there you go, the final 50mm base. So there you go. That is how I made this little 50mm base. I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. I didn't know going into it what it was going to look like. Let me tell you this, from start to finish, this entire thing took less than 4 hours. That was designing it in Tinkercad, 3D printing it, which actually took pretty much the longest. It was about 1 hour print, and then painting it and getting the detail work put on. Depending on what your time's worth, it might be cheaper to just go buy bases, but I like to do things to see if I can do them, but I'm quite pleased with it, and knowing that I made it and it's ready for a mini, I'm as happy as I can be. So hopefully maybe some of you out there can duplicate this, and I'd love to see what you come up with. Again, 4 hours of work, might take you a little less, might take you a little more if you're not that up with CAD. Now, this file, I will make it available as a download. Check the description. and there'll be a link where you can grab this. Right now, I am getting ready to go on holiday break, so I'm going to take a couple weeks off. I'm posting 2 videos a little early. Starting in 2020, I will be posting videos mainly to my Patreon page, where patrons will get to see them right away. And then those videos will become available about 2 weeks later. So you'll still get to see them. You don't have to pay for them. But if you become a patron for $1 a month, you're going to get these kind of videos 2 weeks earlier than everyone else, plus a whole bunch of other videos and PDFs and other stuff like book reviews and game reviews and things like that. Go to patreon.com/thetabletop-engineer if you want to become a patron for just $1 a month. All right, that's it. Happy holidays to everybody, and I'll be back in a few weeks. Take care.